In this lesson, we'll introduce the second library that we'll be using to test our React components, and that is React Testing Library. So Create React App automatically includes both Jest and React Testing Library out of the box, so we do not need to install any additional dependencies. And as a reminder, Jest is our test runner, while React Testing Library is our component mounting library. As we saw in the last couple of lessons, we can use Jest completely by itself. For example, if we want a test runner to test basic things like JavaScript operations. But we need an additional puzzle piece to actually create and render our React components. There is that visual element that Jest does not know how to capture. So what React Testing Library does for us is it instantiates a sample component that we can give it, and it renders it basically in a fake DOM, in a fake simulated browser environment. So we want something that is very similar to a browser and something that has the browser's available constructs, for example, the window object and the document object, but we don't want to use a real browser because we want our tests to be fast. So React Testing Library is going to simulate something like a browser, but again, in the ecosystem of JavaScript rather than a visual web browser like Chrome. The important thing as well to note about the goal of React Testing Library is that we should be testing behavior rather than our component's implementation details. What I mean by that is our tests shouldn't be concerned about whether our component is, for example, using an array internally or an object instead to store data. Rather, we want to test behavior, which means testing how the user would interact with that component when they encounter it in our web application. And the reason for this methodology is if we test component behavior, our tests are more likely to stay stable as we refactor our component code. Okay, so again, React Testing Library will render actual nodes instead of React components. So we can forget about the notion of an app component because the user doesn't understand what an app component is. What the user does understand, however, is something like a button being rendered on the screen and expecting a result whenever they click the button. And that's exactly what our test is going to simulate. We render a component, we look for something that it renders from a DOM perspective, such as a button. We simulate a user action, such as a click, and we confirm that we see what we expect to see. All right, the final thing worth noting before we write our code is that React Testing Library is going to clean up each test. And the way it does that is at the end, after all our assertions are done, it's going to unmount or destroy or remove the React component from the fake DOM, from the virtual DOM, and basically kind of set a clean slate for the next test. And this is critical because it's going to reduce any chance of errors because it's going to eliminate pollution across tests. Pollution occurs when one test's leftovers, for example, some component that it renders to the DOM, persists into the next test. We don't want that. We want all of our tests to be completely independent and isolated so that one test can't accidentally impact another. One general principle that you should follow is you should be able to run your tests in any order and have them pass. You should be able to run your tests either one by one or in a row or in any sequence or randomly, and they should always pass, because that is an indicator that they are independent of one another rather than coupled with another. So you never want one test to run in order to be able to get a second test to pass, because then if the first test doesn't run, then your second test will fail, not because any of the code is wrong, but simply because of the sequence of instructions or the order in which the program flows. Basically, keep your tests small, short, focused on a single responsibility, and independent of the others. So without further ado, let's clear everything we have in our app.test.js file. This file is really intended to test our app component. For every single React component, we're going to have a complementary .test.js file. So the app.test.js file was placed in here by the Create React team with the intent of testing the app component. So let's begin by importing our app component. It is within the same directory, so I can simply look within my current folder and look for the app component. We're going to import it just like so. Then I'm going to need two named exports from the React Testing Library. So right here, I'm going to import with curly braces. The first thing I want is a function called render, and the second thing I want is an object called screen. And those are going to come from @testing-library/React. So whenever you see a name like that, as a reminder, the in front of testing library is nothing special. It just designates an organization under which the repository or code base is hosted. So the name of the parent organization is testing library and the package name is React, but we write the full combination of organization and repo name whenever we import. All right, so we're going to follow the basic jest protocol. So we're going to write a describe function. We're describing what we're testing. In this case, we want to test our app component. We provide a second argument of an arrow function. And here we write our first test. So once again, we invoke the it function. And here we typically write a description for what the component is supposed to do. For now, I'm going to do the simplest thing I can, which is just ensure the component renders without any issue. So I'm just going to write a test of renders. And that way it reads like it renders. Once again, provide an arrow function. And so far, there's nothing in here that is React testing library specific. This is all a regular jest. Okay, so now we're going to utilize that render function that we imported from React testing library. We're going to invoke it. And as you might guess, this is what the component library, the React testing library that is going to render for this test, the component that it's going to create for us. So here we want to pass an app, but not just app like so, but rather using the JSX instantiation syntax. So not just app like so in line, but rather this component syntax, the exact same one we would use if we were creating this component in any other React file. Okay, so with that, we are rendering our app component to this virtual DOM, to this fake DOM that's simulating a browser environment. Okay, the only thing I want to do right now, just to make sure this lesson doesn't go too long, is I want to console log the screen object that we imported. So as soon as we render any sample component, this screen object will represent our browser screen. Once again, we don't have an actual browser. This is just the JavaScript object that is playing that role, that is playing that character. It is an object that is representing the screen that we have onto which the component has been mounted. Now, if you look at this object that we have here, it's going to have a whole bunch of helper methods available on it, such as find by label text, such as query by placeholder text, etc. All of these functions are methods that are going to allow us to query the DOM. In other words, we're going to allow ourselves to search for some elements in our rendered component. So React Testing Library is going to take whatever app has as JSX, is going to transform it into DOM nodes, and this is going to be the functionality we're going to use in order to query that HTML or those DOM nodes to find a given element, to find, for example, a button or an input field or a paragraph tag. And then after that, I'm going to also show you some assertions we're going to make on those elements once we find them. But one step at a time, I think this is enough for now. So to summarize what we did in this lesson, we rendered or instantiated our app component using our render function from React Testing Library. And we also explored the screen object, which we also import. And that screen object is a collection of methods that's going to allow us to query the rendered content, the rendered component, basically the rendered HTML. But remember, there's no actual visual HTML we're seeing. This is all just in JavaScript land. So we're trying to simulate a real-world browser without actually launching a Chrome window to test this component. All right, all of this is living in JavaScript land, in Node land. There's no visual component or visual element when we are testing with React Testing Library. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson. So I will see you in the next one.